All right, so the next topic is mosquito-borne viruses or arboviruses. And for various reasons, the most famous of these are actually related to each other. So viruses from the family Flaviviridae are, in many cases, able to replicate inside mosquitoes. And so we're going to look at three of these now because they infect a lot of different cells, but some of them are in the lymphatic system. And then later we will look at West Nile disease. The West Nile virus infects neurons. So we will see that a little bit later. But they're all from the same virus family, and they're all spread by the Aedes mosquitoes. So mosquitoes from this genus. The most famous one is Aedes aegypti. This is a picture of it. It's, in my opinion, the most beautiful mosquito, and having these striking markings, there are a lot of pictures that just show how kind of striking the coloration is on this mosquito. But it's really a horrible monster of a thing. The Aedes mosquitoes live in various tropical areas, and some of them are now living in the coastal western U.S. And what's unique about these mosquitoes is that they can bite people during the daytime. In some cases, they bite painlessly, and for some reason, the ones that are currently spreading through Southern California, they primarily go after people's ankles. So people just aren't likely to notice them. They also grow well in urban areas. They, for whatever reason, are better at growing in urban areas than a lot of other mosquitoes are. And that makes them excellent candidates for transmitting diseases. Okay, so the first of these diseases we're looking at is yellow fever, and this is another major disease historically, and it still happens in large parts of the world. Outbreaks of yellow fever have been bad enough that cities have been abandoned, at least temporarily. So, for example, Philadelphia was hollowed out by a yellow fever epidemic in the late 1700s. Every year there are hundreds of thousands of known cases and tens of thousands of deaths. And this is it's a painful disease. A lot of people who get it won't have severe symptoms, and they'll recover, but about 15% of them get these severe effects, and one of which is often jaundice, because the virus has a tropism for cells in a liver, and it damages the liver. And you can imagine damaging the liver itself is a very bad thing for the patient. And so a lot of people who get yellow fever will have this severe jaundice and liver damage, and that's why it's called yellow fever, because they turn bright yellow. This is a thing that's common of the flaviviruses, is even within one virus species, like the yellow fever virus, different strains will have different tissue tropisms. So different strains will cause what really should be considered different diseases, but they're close enough that we group them together. There's not much more I really want to say about the yellow fever disease, other than it does have severe forms that can be fatal. Someone who has severe liver damage is in trouble, as you can imagine. There is a vaccine against yellow fever. We don't give it routinely, but countries that have the Aedes mosquitoes, lots of them, that neighbor countries where yellow fever spreads. So countries without yellow fever, where yellow fever could easily spread, they will restrict entry. They won't let people come into their countries unless they have been vaccinated against yellow fever. So if you travel to a lot of African countries, for example, you have to get vaccinated against yellow fever. So that's prevention. The other prevention is always preventing mosquito bites. And then, but there's no specific antiviral treatment, so the key thing is to keep someone hydrated and comfortable, and allow their immune system to do the work. But if their liver is being attacked, that's a much more complicated thing to treat. So again, there have been numerous outbreaks in many different places, but in the US, there have been also numerous outbreaks throughout history. The most recent big one was in New Orleans in the early 1900s. But yeah, if you look in the history of yellow fever, it was a big concern in the United States. And there's been a lot of work to drain wetlands near big cities in the US, especially on the East Coast. And that the idea there is to cut down on mosquito populations. And a lot of different things have been done throughout history that make mosquito-borne diseases less of a threat to urban people in the US. So things like window screens keep mosquitoes mostly out of houses, and people no longer have big open cisterns to collect rainwater where mosquitoes could breed. And so for a lot of those reasons, we don't see yellow fever anymore. But presumably it could spread again in the US if enough people bring it back to an area where these Aedes mosquitoes live. Let's see. The next virus is dengue, and this is a much more widespread virus that is much more well known. Dengue causes huge numbers of infections all over the world, mainly in tropical areas where the Aedes mosquitoes live. And let's get into it. So dengue is known as the bone breaker. That's its nickname. It's people who have symptomatic cases of dengue will feel this extreme pain in their joints or in their limbs. And they'll go through fevers. Something like 2/3 of the cases, though, are asymptomatic. And so that means that this number is a huge underestimate of the number of actual cases of dengue. So this is a huge problem around the world. Dengue is a new disease, relatively new. It's certainly new within the last 1,000 years. And so there is thought that it is still spreading through the world and hasn't yet gotten to all the places it will eventually go. So it's totally possible that in 20 years, dengue will be endemic to Florida and Texas and California. Well, not California, but Florida and Texas, Louisiana, places that have wetlands and hot, humid climates. That is a possibility. We just don't know. So there's a lot of research into dengue, and a lot of clinicians think about dengue and what they can do. So dengue, another way to think about it is not as dangerous as yellow fever. A dengue outbreak, a person who gets dengue is not at the same risk level as a person who gets yellow fever. A person who gets yellow fever does have to consider the possibility that it will kill them. Dengue is usually not that bad, and again, many cases are asymptomatic, but it's extremely painful. And so people will go through cycles of fever with dengue, and in terms of complications, it's a little bit tricky because most of the complications we hear about for dengue are the severe forms of dengue. So I don't really have separate complications. I have the severe forms. And So the really severe forms involve infecting macrophages moving around the body, and when that happens, that can lead to a hemorrhagic fever, and especially young children can get the hemorrhagic form of dengue, and then that is life-threatening. I'm going to skip this slide, but for dengue, there is a new vaccine. There are a lot of vaccines being developed for dengue because it's, again, a huge problem around the world. And the one that's currently licensed is being used in Mexico. That's one of the first countries that started to use it. And it's interesting. It's something to think about. If we look at, let's see, whoops, I skipped it. Well, if we think about this vaccine, CYD-TDV, it protects people against 4 different strains of dengue, and there are 4 different major serotypes of dengue. So this vaccine tries to protect against all of them, and it does give protection to adults. But one of the strange things about dengue is that serotype number 2 typically causes the severe cases and the life-threatening cases. And that typically happens the second time a person is infected with dengue. So the reason for that is that the first time they're infected, there isn't as strong an adaptive immune response. The second time, the dengue particles are opsonized, and so macrophages take them up really aggressively, and that leads to the bad pathogenesis of dengue. So the macrophage infection is part of the problem, and that happens because of an effective antibody response. And so the second time a person gets this second serotype of dengue, if they have the bad luck to be infected by that serotype twice, the second time is when they're really in danger, especially if a young child has been infected multiple times, like in sequential years. So that's the serotype that people are most worried about. And what they found was that the vaccine actually puts children in danger because it primes their immune system against the second serotype. Well, against all of them, but also against the second serotype. So the first time a vaccinated child gets infected by serotype number 2, their immune system does an effective antibody response, opsonizes the virions. The virions infect the macrophages, and the child has a likelihood of getting the hemorrhagic form of dengue. So, and that's a well-known thing. And so the way that people have dealt with that is that only adults can get that, or teenagers, 10-year-olds and up, I guess, are the ones who are allowed to get that vaccine. And that protects the younger children. Because if enough people are vaccinated, dengue doesn't spread as fast. That's kind of the idea. Let's see. This slide looks at some preventions for dengue, some interesting ways of preventing it. That include things like strange bacteria that infect insect cells. And so mosquitoes that are infected by these bacteria, for whatever reason, are protected against dengue, so they won't transmit dengue. And these bacteria actually specialize in infecting entire populations of mosquitoes. So there's the idea that we can basically engineer the mosquitoes using this bacterium to not carry dengue. There are other things like transgenic mosquitoes. They would release male mosquitoes that have been genetically engineered to make, to be infertile. So the male mosquitoes will mate with the females, and the females won't be able to reproduce. And so this is a little bit, well, these are both tricky. They require handling the mosquitoes, but this is certainly possible. And there's a famous case, there's a famous case where one of these strange technologies, both of which require genetic engineering, was embraced by a town in Australia that had dengue outbreaks. Scientists were kind of surprised about this because a lot of people do not want genetic engineering, especially in Australia, where there is a history of attempts to control nature backfiring very badly. Like if you're aware of the cane toad thing, for example, or I think rabbits also. There have been these disastrous introductions in Australia, and so scientists fully expect to not be allowed to do these kinds of trials there. But anyone who has had dengue, a symptomatic case, will be desperate to never have it again. The pain they experience during the fever has been enough to convince people that the number one thing they should think about is never getting dengue again, and they'll do anything to avoid it. So that's kind of wild, and I said that in a kind of a backwards way. This gives some more details about how dengue works and what we typically see. So this is more than I really want you to have to memorize, but the idea is a person would go through fever where they'd have a lot of pain, and then after that they would kind of go through either a rapid improvement or a rapid decline. And there are a lot of different sort of outcomes from dengue in different forms of the disease that we just won't get into. And I only really know about them because one of my colleagues was married to someone who was developing a dengue vaccine, and she looked at my slides and she said, it's way more complicated than you can put in 10 slides. So there you have it. For you all, I just want you to know what dengue is, and that's enough. And so here's where dengue spreads in the red. And so that's certainly close enough to us that we do occasionally see dengue cases in the US. Okay, so that's dengue. Next is Zika, and this is the third flavivirus that we're looking at. Zika is another one that was in the news because there was a huge outbreak. People had been aware of the Zika virus, or I should say it's one of the viruses that virus researchers have been aware of for a long time, but it had never spread widely before. So during this most recent outbreak, we've learned a lot more about the virus because literally millions of cases have happened. So we know that it typically causes a mild asymptomatic infection. Sometimes it causes kind of nonspecific signs such as fever, rash, joint pains, things that you might see with any flu-like illness. And we still don't understand that much about how it works. We just haven't been doing research on this for as long. And once that outbreak wound down, there wasn't as much attention in the developed world to work on it. The main thing people noticed with Zika was the complications that happened, and the one that got the most attention was microcephaly, where babies were born with unusually small heads, and that could lead to well, obviously that restricts brain development, so that could lead to extreme brain damage. So that's terrible, and I'd say one of my thesis students at one of the colleges I worked at put together a very nice research proposal to explain how a mother could pass this virus to the baby, because normally the placenta is a decent barrier to prevent viruses from being vertically transmitted. And I don't think dengue or yellow fever are vertically transmitted, but Zika definitely seems to be. And the other is Ganbare Syndrome, which we also mentioned related to Epstein-Barr virus. And this is the one with damage to peripheral nerves that leads to muscle weakness. And in many cases, it's reversible, and a person does recover fully, but in others, it can be serious and permanent. There's no treatment for Zika, and there's no vaccine for Zika, but whatever way we can use to prevent mosquito bites is how we would prevent Zika from spreading. And, this is another important thing. Zika can be spread through sexual activity. The idea here is that long after a person has recovered from Zika, they will still have the virus in sites in the body that are immune privileged. So sites in the body that don't have adaptive immune responses going on and that can't have inflammation. So the brain doesn't have inflammation. The vitreous fluid in the eyes typically doesn't have any inflammation, and the testes don't have inflammation. So males who were infected with Zika months later could pass it on to someone through sexual activity because it would live in their testes. And that's an example of the immune privileged sites where viruses can hide. So there's that. And these are graphics that show where Zika occurred. I don't believe it ever spread in the U.S. as an outbreak, but people certainly traveled from the U.S. to these countries where the outbreak was happening, and they brought it back to the U.S. with them. So, excuse me, that's all I have about Zika. And yeah, so these arboviruses are, we don't see them much in the US, but we should all be aware of them. So in the next video, we will look at the hemorrhagic fevers.